Hey, it's Maya, and in this video I will be talking about the 12 books that I've read in April. I will very quickly tell you about the summary of them and then share some of my thoughts, likes, dislikes, etc. I will go in the order that I read them in April. I gotta say that usually I have less than 10 5-star reads a year, but this April I read already 4 5-star reads, and I was so surprised. This month has been definitely a month where I reached for a lot of genres that I don't usually read, and the experiment definitely paid off because I found these 4 books that I adore. I'm looking forward to talking about them. So the first book that I finished in April was Sadie by Courtney Summers. This book I picked up first because it was so hyped up half a year ago. A lot of the people who don't usually reach for this genre decided to read this book, and then they raved about it. They gave it 4 or 5 stars, so this is why I decided to pick it up, although it's not usually something that I read. The other reason is because it's about sisters and sisterhood, which is not something you generally see centralized in fiction. I have a sister, so I said I gotta read this book. Although this book is not really about the dynamics between the two sisters, we follow 2 timelines. One is Sadie's, as she's going across country in search of her biological father, who she thinks murdered her sister, and another timeline is the true crime podcast timeline, where we follow this journalist who is uncovering the disappearance of Sadie's. What I liked about this book was this contrast between Sadie's thoughts and motivations and then the outside perspective, which has been represented with this journalist. This book's trigger warnings are definitely child abuse and rape, so be aware of that. As I said, I don't usually pick this genre up because I like to read fiction that helps me escape from real world, and this was definitely very real, very descriptive, and it wasn't a comfortable read. Having said that, this book was very short and I didn't really emotionally connect with the characters, unfortunately. This is why I gave it only 3 stars, and I would recommend this book for people who usually love this type of genre, but for those of you who don't usually read this type of books, I don't think you would enjoy this. Another thing is, if I'm already listening true crime stories, I want to listen to real podcasts about real true crime, not the fictionalized crime. This was another thing that I kept thinking about as I was reading this book, how I would rather be reading about something that actually happened, not a fictionalized true crime podcast. The next book that I read is a French book that I've waited for translation in English for years, and then it came, and then I didn't read it for years, because this is how I operate. It's The History of Violence by Edouard Louis. It's a semi-autobiographical novel about the worst night of his life when he was raped. We see 3 timelines: the night when it happened, the days after it with the police, the medics, and 1 year after it when he visits his sister in the countryside where he grew up. The thing that I liked most about this book, and the thing this book is most unique for, is its unique narration style. We see Edouard Louis, we see his flashbacks into the night when it happened, and then we see his sister, how he is listening in on his sister retelling the event to her husband. We also have the similar situation to Sadie, where we see Edouard Louis' own experience as the victim and his sister's misunderstanding of the events and judgment of him as someone who was on the outside of it. So we see the outsider's perspective on the event and the victim's perspective. I think it was very beautifully described. The book was short and precise, yet lyrical. It could have been overdrawn and overly lyrical, but it wasn't. It was actually really short and precise. Edouard Louis, you can see how he knows philosophy and philosophers, how he knows literature and the elements, stream of consciousness and flashbacks. He incorporates them into the narrative so well. I loved how we would be in something that happened now and then just be transported into his childhood, and it would also very well connect to the whole narrative and what he was trying to explain to us and say to us. This book I gave 5 stars. I loved it so much. I listened to it on audiobook, and I'm definitely planning to get the physical copy to reread it and kind of mark my favorite passages, because as I said, this is more of an introspective novel and philosophical novel, but it's not boring. The next book that I read was actually a classic. My mother read it, she loved it, she gushed about it, and this year I decided to read more classics, especially those that are heavily referenced in other works. I want to understand the references, and this particular book has been referenced in another book that I've read recently, We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. The classic that I'm talking about is 100 Years of Solitude. My mother loves this book, it's her favorite book, this is why I picked it up. This book is actually a generational novel about this town, how it was founded and how it ended, kind of. It's about this one family in this town throughout many generations. I don't usually enjoy generational books, to be honest, because I find it really hard to connect with the characters. I don't spend enough time with them, so this just leaves me not caring about what happens to them. In this book, we are following like hundreds of years of this family's history. We are meeting so many characters, and I just couldn't really connect with the characters. I couldn't care about the characters. Unfortunately, I found that the events that happened didn't really have a point, didn't really have an end game, and I just like my books to have something, some kind of reason, like higher reason for the things that are happening. Another thing was, in this book, everyone carried the same name, because it's the same family, the old-fashioned type of family where the son would inherit his father's or grandfather's name and the daughter her mother's grandmother's name, so everyone was named the same and it was really confusing. This magical realism element in the book, I didn't like it. I don't enjoy magical realism, or at least I still haven't found a book that I would enjoy that has these elements. And in this book as well, I don't like how magical realism has no rules to it. It's not like fantasy worlds where you have magic that is strictly by some rule. In magical realism, anything can happen, and that's really, I don't like that. I don't like to be surprised in that way. I realized that the author wanted to make the ending really relevant to some kind of magic realism elements that was sprinkled throughout the story, but it was so underwhelming. The ending was so underwhelming, and I was so mad at the ending. Oh, I was so mad at the ending, and this left me really not liking this book at all. I think I gave it 3 stars because I understand why so many people like it, why it's on so many lists of books to read in your lifetime, but to me it's just, it left me emotionally drained or kind of not really feeling anything at all. Next book that I read was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and it's my second novel of Taylor's, and the first one that I read was Daisy Jones and the Six. I read it last year, I loved it, I cried for it, it left me emotionally broken in a good way. To establish her as my favorite author, I decided to read some of her other works, and one of the most popular books is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Unfortunately, I did not like this book as much as Daisy Jones and the Six. I gave it only 3 stars. I don't know what it was, but I just couldn't connect. If you don't know, this book is about Evelyn Hugo. She's like the old Hollywood actress who had 7 husbands, and she never really talked about her life. So one day she decides to do an interview of her whole life and basically the explanation of why she had 7 failed marriages, and she picks this young, inexperienced journalist, Monique. No one knows why she picks Monique, but she wants Monique specifically to make this biography about Evelyn Hugo's life. This mystery of why Monique was picked to make the biography was what kept me reading and what kept the story interesting. Other than that, I loved Evelyn as a character. She was so strong-willed, eccentric, and selfish. She accepted her true nature, which wasn't really likable. However, other characters just fell flat for me. The love interest, the husbands, and other characters, I did not really care about them. I just want to say that this book is queer. It's got these 7 husbands, but they're not the true love of Evelyn Hugo's. Besides not really connecting with the characters, the book has so much build-up of why Monique was chosen, and to be honest, it was surprising but underwhelming. Overall, I enjoyed this book. I gave it 3 stars. I read it pretty quickly, but if I had to choose, Daisy Jones and the Six is so much better. Daisy Jones and the Six made me feel things I didn't know I could feel, whereas Evelyn Hugo was just a book to scratch off my TBR. The next book that I read was another uncomfortable but very necessary read. It's the book, one of the most hyped up books in 2020 in my opinion, and if I had to choose, if I had the power, I would definitely put it as a required reading in schools instead of Lolita. It's My Dark Vanessa, a book that talks about Vanessa's coming to term with her abuse as a 15-year-old girl by the hands of her English professor. We are literally put into Vanessa's shoes. Her introspections, her feelings, her moods are depicted so perceptively, fleshed out so well that you really begin to understand. I really understood her feelings. We're following 2 timelines, one when she was a teenager and when she just met this professor, and the second one when she was 30 years old and how she begins to realize that she's been actually abused when she was a teenager, because other girls from her school coming forward and saying they were abused by the same professor. So this makes her wonder and realize that she has also been abused. I did not enjoy reading this book. I felt really depressed. I felt like Vanessa, essentially. I felt really dark, and her flashbacks to the past were really depressing. The book really had no hope, no future, and this really made me feel like I have no hope and no future. I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, but I would not reread it again. And I think I've said already, I prefer escapism and escape fiction. So when I read My Dark Vanessa type of books, I really need a palate cleanser after them because they're so depressing. The next book that I read is my ultimate 5-star read, which is also the book that I love most out of all of the books that I've read this year and past year combined. It's Us Against You by Friedrich Bachmann. This book left me shattered in a million pieces, and I am still collecting these pieces all over the floor of my bedroom. Oh my god, I love it so much. Wow. So I'll be honest here, I read Man Called Ove by Bachmann last year and I just thought it was okay. I gave it 3 stars. It didn't really make me feel a lot of things. After that I read Beartown, which is the first installment in this Beartown series. Us Against You is the second. So I read Beartown last year as well and I thought it was okay. I gave it 4 stars. I really don't know why or how I decided to pick the second book in the series, because the first book was just okay for me. I'm so glad I did. The second book establishes the characters even more. So if you don't know, this story is about Beartown, this town that is obsessed with hockey. Omnipresent narrator who kind of introduces us to a lot of characters. This is why I think it took me all the way to book 2 to kind of connect with the characters. I loved all of them, especially Benji. Benji, my god. I think it's all because of Benji. I love him. He's the type of loner / misunderstood character that I live for. This book is definitely a character study above all. Yes, it's about hockey, but it's more about how each character has connections to hockey and how through hockey they escape from their problems, or how hockey causes the problems in their life. The narration of this book was very similar to The Book Thief. The narrator really played with events. He really hinted at something that might happen, but when it came to the actual event, it was so twisted and different from what the narrator wanted me to think it was gonna be that I was so shocked, which doesn't happen often. This is why I love this book, because it made me feel so many things. There is a lot of characters, but Bachmann somehow managed to make me care about all of them, and especially Benji. I love Benji. The themes of this book are so varied. You have the aftermath of rape, political corruption, sexual identity, sports and sexism in sports, and general small town mindset. I have grown up in a small town, or more like a village, so it was really relatable, especially the sports part, because everyone in my country are obsessed with football, so it was really relatable in that way, and also the sexism surrounding sports. I thought this book was very smart. I thought the characters were so realistic, and I definitely warmly recommend to read this series. The next book I actually listened to on audiobook, and it's non-fiction. It's No Time to Spare by Ursula Le Guin. It's my first work of hers. It's more like a diary. And I was told this book was about writing, which it wasn't. Le Guin usually writes science fiction, but this is her diary, as I said. I can see that she's smart. She also discusses some other aspects of her life, but there's a lot about her cat which I didn't care about. There wasn't nearly enough about writing as I thought. I thought this was a really boring read, and I ended up listening to it before falling asleep every night because it was a nice, good bedtime story about her cat again. I didn't care about the cat. I don't really recommend this book. I don't even have a lot of things to say about the book. I do want to read Le Guin's science fiction novels, but this wasn't interesting. Next book that I read is another classic, and I read it as a part of Dark Academia book club on Tumblr, and we read The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I am not familiar with Sylvia Plath's poetry, so The Bell Jar was actually the first work that I've read of hers, and it's the only prose piece of work that she's ever written, and it's a semi-autobiographical novel about basically her depression. The book follows this young girl in New York as she realizes she has nothing to look forward to in her life, so she kind of tries to discover the best way to end her life. It's set in the 60s. It has this strong, willful, eccentric character, which I think is really Sylvia Plath, and I liked her as a character, but overall I thought this book was really boring. It didn't really have a plot, but it was luckily short, so I read it quickly. The thing that I liked about this book was the depiction of mental illness in the 60s and the mental institutions and the shock therapy, and how horrible it all was. I still can't believe that this is something that we as the human species did, like these shock treatments. Horrible. As I said, overall this book was okay. I gave it 3 stars. I don't feel like it changed me in some certain way. I will say that it's very depressing, so if you're struggling with depression right now, I would not recommend this to be a book that you read. One of the books that is in this year's Women's Prize list is the book that I read next, and it's Girl, Woman, Other. It's a short story collection about 12 or so women. Each woman gets her chapter. These are all women of color. Some are queer, some aren't, and each chapter covers one woman's life. I really had a hard time to emotionally invest myself in this woman's life. That being said, this book is really feminist. It deals with themes that are so important. It really made me want to read more feminist fiction and non-fiction. This book is relevant, but it was kind of boring, and I felt the emotional distance with the characters because chapters weren't that long and each woman had only 1 chapter, so I didn't really connect with them. This is why I gave this book 3 stars. Next book is another 5-star read, and this next book I actually thought at some points that it could surpass Us Against You, and it's a crime mystery which I don't usually reach for, and the book is In the Woods by Tana French. This book is a crime mystery about Ryan, who is a murder detective in the Dublin murder squad, and he's discovering this 12-year-old girl's murder that somehow connects to the case of 2 missing 12-year-olds 20 years prior in the same village, and consequently Ryan has been the 3rd child that's been uncovered in the woods, all covered in blood, his 2 friends missing, and he not remembering anything from this event. And now he's uncovering this new 12-year-old girl's murder, but no one knows that he has ties to this other missing children's case from 20 years before. The writing style and the pretentiousness of the narrator was definitely reminiscent of The Secret History by Donna Tartt, especially how dislikable Ryan as main character is, was so similar to Richard from The Secret History. The book was really long, it was really descriptive, but it wasn't dense and it wasn't boring. I thought the mystery was really mysterious, it wasn't see-through, it was really complex and page-turning. What I didn't like in the book though was the treatment of Cassie. She's the partner of Ryan's and she's the only female murder detective, and in every scene, almost every scene, we were constantly reminded of how female she is. Some of the views were really old-fashioned, and I'm still not sure whether this is the author's view or Ryan as a character's view. I also found him kind of dislikable at some of the thoughts that he had about Cassie and other female characters. But anyway, this book was very character-driven and introspective without being boring or slow. The book is the first book in the Dublin Murder Squad series, and I'm definitely planning to continue with the series. I think this book is for you even if you don't usually reach for crime mystery novels, which I don't usually reach for those. But this book is definitely more than that. It's definitely a character study as well. It's definitely pretentious, and it has some philosophical thoughts as well. After In the Woods, I read another 5-star read, which is the most surprising 5-star read of the month. I didn't know I would give this 5 stars. I thought first 3 stars and then 4 stars, and by the end I was blown away by how unique this short story collection is, and it's Someone Will Love You in All Your Damaged Glory. Let's just take a moment to appreciate this beautiful title. It is long, but it is so unique, and it's really shows you how unique the short stories in this book are gonna be. It never happens, but I loved every short story in this collection. The thing you have to know is that every story has a supernatural element to it. Almost every story has something weird about it. My favorite stories are about this rock band who got hit by lightning as they were drunk, and then they got superpowers, and they could use those superpowers only if they got drunk. The other story that I enjoyed was one about a brother and sister and their family on a vacation. The point and center of every story are relationships. Relationships between lovers, between friends, between siblings. One story is from the perspective of the dog and their relationship with their owner, and I just said there for dog. It's really about conflicts between people as well, and I thought it was done so realistically. Although these weird supernatural elements were put into the stories, they were so well incorporated that it just, you wouldn't even think that these things don't belong into the story. I listened to this on audiobook, and the voice actors were so brilliant. There were so many of them, and every story had a different voice actor. Some stories had many of them. Saying that, I do want to get a physical copy of this book as well to reread it and to kind of underline my favorite passages. And since these stories are so unique, I would definitely recommend this book to everyone, no matter what you usually read, because I don't think you can put this collection into one genre only. And the last book that I read this month was so beautiful. I gave it 4 stars because I think the part of the beauty of the book was that I watched the TV show before reading the book. But yeah, the TV show, just like any basic human right now, I also watched and enjoyed Netflix's The Witcher. I watched season 1 before reading The Last Wish, which is one of the books that covers season 1, and I got really familiar with the characters through the TV show, and I fell in love with the characters, and this is why I think my enjoyment of The Last Wish was heightened by tenfold. So if you don't know, this book is set in a fantasy world where we have Geralt, who is the Witcher, which means he's been experimented on and turned for the sole purpose to fight and kill monsters, and we see his life as he's going through different adventures and how he's dealing with the demons outside, but also the demons within. We also have a wide array of characters, especially in the TV show. They're so beautiful and so perfect, and I'm so glad I watched the TV show before reading the book, because once I was already familiar with the characters, just going into the books and reliving all of the things that happened in the series was so enjoyable for me. The dialogues are definitely a center in the book. Although the TV show has great dialogues, the book is much more philosophical and kind of self-deprecating in the sense that characters often, especially Geralt, often monologues about some philosophical things, and other people are like, why are you just saying this right now? This is not the time or place to be philosophical. Let's just like move on to the point of our conversation. Characters are very intelligent and they really have a sense of themselves. They're really well established. When fantasy is written by men, I'm always scared about the sexism and the male gazy things in the book. And in this book, there were some male gazy aspects, but the ones that I cared about most, especially Yennefer, who is the main love interest, she was so well done. She's my favorite character and I loved her and I would die for her, honestly. So the book is actually one of two prequels, short story collections that are prequels to the actual series of 8 or so books. The Last Wish doesn't really follow any central plot. It's got many short stories that are kind of intertwined. The Last Wish is one of the stories, the last story of the collection. It's also my favorite. It's the story where Yennefer and Geralt meet for the first time, and they're both so headstrong, so intelligent, and they're constantly trying to outwit each other, which I love this type of enemies to lovers trope so much, especially if it's well done. And they're both so intelligent and so well spoken that their dialogues are just beyond. They're so interesting and I could read how they talk. If all of the 8 books in the series are about Yennefer and Geralt talking, I will devour them. I will love them forever. This book definitely focuses more on the characters and the dialogues rather than the action scenes and monster fighting, which I really enjoy. I really enjoy these character-centric, character-driven fantasy stories. That being said, this fantasy world definitely takes its time. It's a slower paced story and it takes some time to be set up. So if you usually read young adult fantasy, fast-paced fantasy books, this might be slow for you. Okay, these have been all of the books that I read in April. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, make sure to like it and to subscribe to my channel if you want. Also, you can add me on other social media where I also talk about books, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Goodreads. All of the links are in the description down below. And as always, I'm looking forward to seeing you in my next video, and have a nice day.